Hello, good evening and welcome, high degree students of the University of Adelaide, invited members of the JBI collaboration. Welcome to this first JBI Postgraduate Research Degrees seminar series. My name is Alex Mignoni and it's my pleasure to be here to help facilitate this 6-part webinar series. We'll be coming to you live for the next 6 weeks every Thursday night at 8. I hope you can be with us for the duration. Before we go any further, just to let you know, we're coming to you live from the University of Adelaide, and we acknowledge the Kaurna people as the true custodians of this land, and we respect and value their past, present, and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. So just some information about the session. We'll be recording this and making it available to you on the JBI YouTube channel. Now, all participants have logged in a listening only mode, so we can't see or hear from you, but I certainly encourage you to interact with us. You can do that either via the general chat facility, or if you've got a specific question for our speaker, you can do that via the question and answer functionality. And any feedback that you have in the session, you can direct to me. Now, for each of our 6 seminars, we'll have a different host, a different member of JBI academic staff. This evening, I'm pleased to welcome the Postgraduate Coordinator for High Degrees within JBI. He's also JBI's Director of Implementation Science and the Editor-in-Chief of JBI Evidence Implementation. I'm pleased to welcome my colleague, Associate Professor Craig Lockwood.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you. Really glad to be able to have this series for you in spite of the challenges presented in 2020 by viral conditions and other things that have made life challenging for everyone. And we do very much appreciate that you're here tonight as well, knowing that a lot of you are in a complicated situation in terms of balance of life, study, clinical responsibilities as well. So this is for you, and we hope that you get a lot of enjoyment and value out of the series that we've been working to bring for you. It's my great pleasure to introduce somebody that most of you already know quite well, Professor Edoardo Aromataris. I just gave him a promotion, sorry, Associate Professor Edoardo Aromataris. You can see his details on screen, and those of you who know him well in terms of his strength in methodology, his passion and commitment to synthesis science, and also as a teacher and lecturer into the Masters and PhD programs. Ed is the first of our keynote speakers for this high degree seminar series. I'm very pleased to be inviting him to give a talk on aligning review questions with different methodologies and methods. While Ed's talking, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat function so that we can harvest your questions and present them for discussion at the end. So please continue to engage with us via the chat function throughout Ed's talk. And once again, have a good experience this evening.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Craig. And thank you to all of you who've come online and decided to join us this evening. And thank you, Craig, also for the opportunity to speak about the topic that's listed here. And I think it's fair to say that this topic has really arisen out of, I guess, direct conversations and discussions that we have quite frequently, not just between Craig and myself, but as supervisors here in JBI as a part of our high degree research program. But beyond that, I think also as discussions as peer reviewers for journals, looking at reviews that are submitted to journals, we're invited to peer review manuscripts, and also as editors of journals. And I guess in this session now, what I'd really like to do, just to reflect that, beg your pardon, is really hone in on, and what Craig asked me to speak to was the essence, to hone in on the review question. And some of the tricks that I use as an editor, as an author, as a reviewer, to take you on a bit of a journey about revisiting the review question, its importance in underpinning about the different methodological approaches that we will undertake with our review, and some of the tricks that I use to reflect on and different ways of looking at the same question, the same review question that's presented to me. And in essence, to that last point, by the end of the, in about I've been given about 20 minutes to speak to you. By the end of this presentation, I'll just use some examples to illustrate what it is that I'll be speaking about prior to that. And while thinking about this topic, so this is the plan for this evening, while thinking about this topic, I must admit I was reflecting on the topic. It was aligning different methodologies to different review questions. I couldn't help but think an alternative title to this question, and I guess that really speaks in part to the heart of the way I go about this, is this idea of keeping an eye on the end game. What is the answer that you're actually looking for? So we start with a question, but if we've got the end point very clear, it can help us on our journey all the way through. And ultimately, I know when I speak to, certainly in discussions with my higher degree students, and particularly those who are starting out, when I'm looking at their first versions of their protocols, for example, or certainly when I'm looking at manuscripts as an editor, it's really part of the art of avoiding that question that comes through in terms of, why did you do it like that? The question that nobody wants to hear. Specifically so, nobody really wants to hear that right after they've done a whole lot of work. And this idea of keeping an eye on the end game right from the very beginning can potentially, I think, take you on lead you to a position where your research, your review, your systematic review has the potential to be more informative, and that you as a reviewer or an author, or if you're imparting some critique to another author, may have some greater return on the investment, and that is their work. So without any further ado, just want to dive into the review question and the importance of the part that it plays. Now, I know across those of you listening, certainly our HDR students, there are some of you who are just starting out, and there are some of you who are probably right towards the end of your trajectory in your higher degree research, and also writing your thesis and as authors. But like I said, some of this will be, as soon as you become an author, you may very well be asked to peer review similar manuscripts to one that you've just produced by other journals. So I do hope that you'll find this useful, even though some of this, what I'm speaking about right at the beginning, will certainly be just a bit of a refresher. So this idea of the review question, it is the universal first step in the systematic review process. And dogma tells us, systematic review dogma suggests that it is the most important, one of the most important steps, and I'd like to suggest that it is the most important step. When we think about the steps that we take in the systematic review, and there are some clearly defined steps, which I'll show in a moment, the question directly informs the technical basis for two of those key steps. One is the search strategy, and directly from our question, the concepts that are there is where we start harvesting and developing our first search terms to then spread out across our try out across our databases to identify, locate our evidence. And the second important part is we use those same key concepts that come out of our question to form the basis for the eligibility criteria for our review, or the inclusion criteria, or if there are any specific exclusion criteria. That is essentially, they're the key technical aspects that come out of our question. But the question, I think, and I'd like to reinforce to you here, is much more important than that. Those of you who have been through our wonderful comprehensive systematic review training program will be very familiar with this schematic here, this diagram, which clearly shows the steps in the systematic review process. And here they're presented as a process. And these really are the key characteristics of the systematic review. And they're presented here, and you'll see that immediately in the figure, in a very linear fashion. And I think that speaks to the heart of the importance of the question. And it really is, because it's linear, make no mistake that the sins of the father, if we make any mistakes in the question right at the beginning, we will see those mistakes or any problems appear right down here at the end. That idea of keeping your eye on the end game. Our question, as I mentioned, will define technical aspects such as the inclusion criteria, potentially some of the search terms that we use, and through that, beyond that, it will also help us define some of the tools that we use throughout these remaining points. But there's absolutely no doubt that, for example, if we just think at the standard formula for a systematic review of effects, where we define intervention comparator outcomes as well as the population, that a broad question will have impact down here. So when we come to synthesis, we'll find a broad heterogeneous data set that we have to deal with. And that will be unavoidable generally from a broad question. It will provide added challenges to the synthesis depending on their experience and how clear an answer that they can present to their question, or whether they become entrenched in a really difficult process of trying to filter out fine details. And a lot of that process will depend on what goes on up here. So I've already mentioned some of the technical basis, the technical information that we can get, that we do use our question for in the review process. But if we just take a step back, fundamentally, that review question also helps us determine the type of review that we're doing. And that is very, very, very important when we really think about that keep our eye on what answer are we after and how are we going to get there. And type, for those of you who aren't familiar, many of you will be, these are the types, again, those of you who've been through the wonderful comprehensive systematic review training program by JBI, these are the types of systematic reviews that JBI have developed some guidance and methodology for. And in some cases, the differentiation is purely around methods, I'd suggest. And they move through these first four, which are the quantitative review types. So the effectiveness review, obviously, to assess the effectiveness of interventional therapy, we might move towards prevalence or cumulative incidence. Etiology and risk, here we're not dealing with an intervention per se, but more likely potentially a passive exposure. And diagnostic test accuracy, we're assessing differences between reference tests and index tests. And then we can the JBI methods and methodologies also move beyond that into qualitative reviews. And please do bear in mind that JBI has one methodology of qualitative synthesis, meta-aggregative synthesis, but out there in the realm of evidence synthesis, there are many, many different types of methodologies, depending on your end game. I won't go into any great detail in any more of these. I will focus again on scoping reviews, because they're quite unique in terms of the challenges that that I see that they present to authors and how they go about conducting their business when it comes to this type of research. So the question very much helps us with our technical aspects and helps us determine the type of review. And that is all important because the type of review is then going to lead into the tools that we have for the job. And if we can get all of that in alignment, we can find, if we can get it all lined up, we'll find that we have the right tools for the job to be able to construct and build our research and work towards our answer. The alternative is that if we use the wrong tool for the job, we might end up going through into a slightly more destructive process rather than constructive process. And in actual fact, the whole house will come falling down as we start moving through that linear process. And we find we're actually getting further and further and further away from the answer that we're actually intending. So just to reiterate and reinforce that, our type of systematic review that aligns to our question can help us will have influence over how we go about our searching. We may use terms that are specific to that type of review. To be quite common, we're talking about diagnostic test accuracy or prevalence, for example. They will determine, to some extent, some aspects of our study selection. The types of studies that we include. in a review of effects that might focus on experimental or quasi-experimental studies, for example, versus a review purely looking at modifiable or non-modifiable risk factors that may in fact limit itself to the upper echelon of observational research or naturalistic research, and that is cohort studies or case control studies. Other tools that it will certainly influence are those that we use to assess risk of bias or study quality, for example, which will look quite different depending on our question, and keeping that eye as we look through the review process and knowing that for this particular question, this type of review is appropriate and these are the appropriate tools. And certainly that is all important, and just focusing on quantitative reviews, on our statistical methods, because it will always lead through to the presentation of our synthesis, and it's therein that our answer really lies. And that's, I think, what's really important here, and when, again, the trick that I use as author, reviewer, and editor to keep my eye on that end game, to say, well, this is my question, what answer am I looking for, and how am I going to present that? That lies here in our presentation of synthesis that runs directly out of this and all of this analytical component that we've just invested our time in. So what might that look like in a quantitative review? Well, in this case, here instantly, as an experienced author, as experienced editor, and I hope many of you in the audience can see this. I know some of our students will be able to, because some of these are their results. But in the top panel is exactly what I would expect to see from a review, looking at the effectiveness of an intervention or therapy. Here we have a dichotomous outcome, but I can see instantly there are experimental and control groups. And the answer to my question is here. This is what I'll be reporting on. This is one of my outcomes, whatever it may be in this case, and that is in the presentation of the synthesis. That's where it lies. Similarly, as this synthesis, the statistical synthesis here looks slightly different. Here, in the when we're looking at we use randomized controlled trials, we have raw event counts. Out of randomization, that all makes perfect sense. We've corrected, it's corrected for unknown confounders. In this case, we see something different, and I can instantly align that endpoint synthesis to my question and the type of review that I am doing, because I fully expect to see this, where here I can see that we have logs of the actual risk estimates that are being presented by these individual studies. And the meta-analysis is actually combining those risk estimates that now contain their adjusted risk estimates that have been adjusted for confounders that have not been corrected for by randomization in any way. And again, here lies the answer to our question, what we'll be explaining in our review. And this third panel, it's still a meta-analysis. We describe it in a similar way, all of these meta-analyses, but instantly, I hope you can see to your eye, you can see that this data is quite different. We're talking about proportions. And here we have proportions from individual studies that have been meta-analysed. And here is my overall effect estimate that's expressing the prevalence of a particular issue that we've been investigating. So as soon as I read a question, I know what to expect. And that's part of the art of understanding your methodology and understanding diverse methods of synthesis. And it can help, again, it is important that authors really do know where it is they're heading. And it's important, this is the sort of investment that really is required at the protocol stage of a review. And it can always help, I believe, for a successful review undertaking. Pardon me. So, now just to take a step back. So I do want to now, just in the final and second phase of this presentation, is just speak to some examples. And I've taken some of these examples that are about to come. They come from submissions to my journal. I have changed some key and relevant points around them. just so they're not identifiable. But the framework and the structure and most of the language is identical to what we have received. But I'd just like to keep in mind when I talk about aligning questions with criteria, the type of review, and the answer that we're looking for and how we're going to get there. To just refresh that when we talk about quantitative reviews, you'll be familiar with population, intervention, comparator, and outcome for reviews of effects, population, condition, and context for reviews looking at prevalence or cumulative incidence, population, index test, reference test, and diagnosis for diagnostic test accuracy reviews, and population exposure and outcome for etiology and risk reviews. Now, down the bottom, I've also included population, concept, and context for scoping reviews. And I've included that there deliberately because in my experience, it's actually the scoping reviews that are causing authors and reviewers, I think, a lot of confusion, I think, is probably the safest way to describe it. And I see this confusion for many reasons. The scoping review is perfectly designed for a really broad question. And all of us as reviewers and researchers are looking for the biggest bang for buck out of our work. And I think it leads people into a bit of a trap from what I've seen in terms of losing sight of the question that they're actually trying to answer because they're trying to bite off too much in one foul swoop. Just work through these examples. So in this first example, and as I said, I've changed, these were submitted to our journal, but I've changed a few key features. So these have come from authors all around the world. I have 3 examples here. And I just want to work through some key details. I apologise for all the text, but the nature of the examples that we have here demands that there be text on the slide. So here, the primary objective of this scoping review is to examine the association between sedentary behaviour and tobacco consumption or smoking. And instantly there are cues here that should get us all thinking. These authors want to quantify how sedentary behaviour and smoking are associated in their scoping review. Now, scoping review to me instantly, and I hope I hope you'll agree with me. If you need to refresh your memories, it's in the wonderful JBI manual for evidence synthesis. But scoping reviews are really for mapping. They're for providing a bit of a lay of the land. Here, instantly, these authors wish to quantify, and beyond that, describe characteristics or participants or groups of these included studies, and also identify mediators and moderators of that association that they wish to quantify. And another key point I'd like to draw your attention to here is that studies must measure sedentary behaviour and smoking as either an independent or dependent variable. That instantly says to me that these authors are interested, is sedentary behaviour, the more I sit around, likely to increase or decrease the amount I smoke? Or if I'm a smoker, is it likely to increase or decrease the amount that I sit? In other words, they're interested, does this relationship go both ways? And they've set this up nicely for participants, concept, and context. Now, to approach this as a scoping review, I can see a big picture materialising of a whole lot of numbers from primary studies. They may be including systematic reviews, but I don't actually think they'll get to the heart of what they're interested in, to examine this association and quantify. I think a more appropriate approach here would actually be to investigate this as a review of etiology and risk, where the population will be adults, the exposure may be the smoking or the sedentary behaviour, and the outcome will be the amount of cigarettes you're smoking or the amount of time you spend sitting around, conversely. That's one example. In the second example, see the question, what infection control practices are associated with the prevention of transmission of SARS or COVID-19 in hemodialysis settings? And instantly here, the authors, you can see, have set this up as a review of etiology and risk, where they've defined an exposure. And it's out naturally when we're talking about virus, we're exposed to virus. And I can only suggest that the authors have been led towards, to suggest that this is a review of etiology and risk because of this idea of it being exposed to a virus. But again, that idea of keeping your eye on what's the answer to your question helps you formulate your conceptualization and helps you choose the right tool for the job. Because here you'll see that there's no difference between what they've defined as their exposure and what they've defined as their outcome. And that should be really a clue that this tool may not be the right one for the job, or there may be a better tool for the job. And in this case, I'd suggest that yes, the participants can be patients of any age, but the intervention will be the infection control practices. There may be a comparator of usual care or other type of control practices, and this transfer or this transmission is in fact the outcome, and that this would better be prepared as a review of effects. Similarly, in this third example, again, a scoping review. Do adolescents in Australia experience specific drug use patterns? Among adolescents, we want to know about known risk or protective factors for specific types, and what are effective preventative interventions? Now, we get clue about what they're talking about here. I know you haven't read the background and the like, but instantly, this review will include studies that examine illicit drug use or prescription drug misuse as the outcome variable. There are giveaway clues in what's being presented here that there may be alternative ways to do this job. And instantly, I can see that what they're potentially interested in is what's the prevalence of illicit drug use or prescription drug misuse in adolescents in Australia? What are known risk factors? So we have a population, we know what our outcome is, it's drug use, and we want to investigate what potential exposures are in between, exposures, that is modifiable or non-modifiable risk factors, what they may be in between. Again, here for each of these, there may be 2 separate systematic reviews of etiology and risk. And for adolescents, what effective preventative interventions and drug treatment programs exist. Again, I see potentially a review of effects that is actually identifying them through a broad search strategy and then quantifying that through our meta-analyses to see which actually have an effect versus which ones don't. And I can only suggest that because often authors will come with a very broad objective, and that instantly links to this type of methodology and this aim, this desire to try and answer everything in one foul swoop, where potentially that broad objective to understand what it is about adolescent drug usage patterns might be better answered by probably, as I see here, 3 systematic reviews. Or it could be within one big comprehensive review, but is feeding across the different tools, that is the different methods that are available within the quantitative realm of syntheses to answer these specific questions. And it may very well be that here that there'd be, when we talk about our inclusion or our eligibility criteria, that would extend to having 3 different components for those 3 different reviews. So, just to summarise all of that, part of that trick about I think that can help with a successful review project as an author, or to be able to provide some constructive critique as a reviewer or an editor, is that idea of being able to see through the question and see right through to the end point that answer. And what is it that I expect to put on paper and deliver to the readers as an answer, and close that loop to help us narrow down the tools, the methodologies and the methods that we use to get there. So I'm running a bit over time, but I'll just say everything that I've spoken about, you will find all of that wonderful detail within the JBI Manual for Evidence Synthesis. And across the realm, don't forget, as researchers, yes, we have a question that we aim to answer with our systematic review, and that's what I've been speaking about, our systematic review question. But there's an entire body of research evidence out there, and there's cohorts of researchers who actually investigate how to do this better. And here's just an example of directly of what I've been speaking about, of this type of research and this type of guidance. And in there, you'll find wonderful detail about how to link questions, some examples, and the right, to help you find the right tools for your job, which if we don't get it right from the start, we are unlikely to have a very successful review. And I'll hold it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ed. That's a really a great presentation. I think it's unbelievably helpful to have somebody go through structurally, not just, you know, in a global level, because often we seem to look at examples that are beautifully typecast. But the reality for a lot of our students, and in fact, for a lot of review questions out there in the world, they don't necessarily fit the neat scenario. So these real world examples are fantastic. I had a couple of questions that came out of the chat function here. So you've illustrated a couple of cases where somebody went one direction, they probably could have or should have gone a different direction. Example number 2 in particular illustrated that. The question was, so what do you do if you're down the track and you then realize, whoops, I probably should have done X instead of Y?
That's a really good question. That's a good question. And admittedly, it's a position many of us will have found ourselves in previously. I can hand on heart say that I ended up in exactly that same position on my first foray into systematic reviews. But most of this idea around the question development, we invest that time through those steps at the stage of the protocol. And part of the aim of the protocol, and so much of what we do around this idea of a rigorous assessment of available evidence, is based on alleviating or minimizing risk of bias in the process. So my advice to the author who's gone too far, who's gone to a certain point through their review process and realized, I'm straying from where I wanted to be, this actually isn't the answer I was looking for, by following, you know, this process, is by going backwards and deviating from your protocol in any way, shape or form, are you introducing risk of bias to your process, or can you list it as a deviation? Now, so I can change a statistical method pretty easily, depending on the data that I've extracted, and I can do that pretty much without offending anyone for the most part, or introducing, I think, a great deal of risk of bias to the process. But if I've actually changed my question in such a way that now I suddenly have to change, it would have implications for my search strategy, that's a different story. That probably means that you have to start again from square one, and may mean that you're retracting protocols or updating protocols and re-registering in Prospero and the like. And I think that's the view you'll have to take, and the view that should be taken when we backtrack and need deviations from what we intended to do, bearing in mind, I think, it should always be on the basis of what risk of bias am I introducing into this work, that other people will look at it and say, now, this was just iterative, which a systematic review shouldn't be, and will it have implications on the believability of the whole process?
That's a really helpful answer. Can I just ask you to extend on that in relation to what is the likelihood that you'd have to redo your search? So generally in a JBI review, you and everyone online know that we don't filter methodologically in our searches. We focus on the topic and the PICO. Can you see a scenario where you would need to redo your search?
I've encountered scenarios, and thank you for for jumping in on that point, Craig, because that is a clear distinction there, where you focus on the methodological issue. So you might come across the case, for example, where if you've changed conceptually part of what it is you're investigating. And the reason may be that initially your question was so focused that you found no evidence. Well, then you'll be going back and changing it and researching. I was going to use the other example where you had it so broad that what came out the bottom you really couldn't synthesize, because the parameters that you'd put around it meant that, by necessity, because you had such broad inclusion criteria, by necessity, you couldn't do any meta-analysis, and you were introducing subsequent subgroups and the like. But it'd be more likely where it's around a conceptual issue as opposed to a methodological issue.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Ed, I think you may have planted this question in the audience because Brett Ritchie has asked probably the question you most would want to answer. Here it is. Should an early career researcher stay away from scoping reviews as they appear to be a process that have many traps for the inexperienced?
Do we have another half hour or so? Sorry. No. Thank you for that question, Brett. Okay, I'll give you my opinionated view on all of this. My fear is that many authors are turning to scoping reviews, for the reason that I mentioned, because we all have big ideals and big dreams, and we want to get the most out of our research. And that idea that the scoping review can tackle that broad objective, that broader question, is really, really attractive for reviewers. I'm also fearful that because it doesn't involve some of the complex statistical analyses that we find in quantitative reviews, that some authors, rather than, and certainly for HDR students, rather than take that as an opportunity to invest and have lots of questions about, well, how does this synthesis work? What are the statistical methods? What can I learn here? Shy away from it and think they're heading towards an easier option. But what scoping reviews inevitably lead to often lead to are very, very large projects and this idea of the art of synthesis, and there is an art of synthesis, really has to come to the fore when you're bringing together often so much information around a particular topic or a question. So I wouldn't necessarily say that early career researchers should avoid them. I think if you have a legitimate question, that you should always be looking for the right tool for the job. And there are certain questions that the scoping review is absolutely the right tool for the job. What I was hoping to convey here is that ability to be able to sit back and really reflect and look through your question. What is it that the answer that you're after? And if the answer that you're after is a map, then the scoping review is the way to go.
Couldn't have answered it better myself. Thank you so much, Ed, for that, and Brett for that question as well. I think we're actually out of time or close to out of time. So Ed, thank you very much on behalf of everyone who's been here tonight. I just want to hand over to Alex for some final notices, I think.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, guys. Well done. That was a fabulous presentation, Ed. Next week, thank you all for your attendance, by the way, this evening. It's been very well attended. Everyone who's registered, you've persevered with the registration process, and we appreciate that. Next week, we'll be welcoming back one of our former JBI students, Anika Theodoulis. She'll be speaking in relation to what she has done since completing the Masters of Clinical Science with JBI, and talking about giving us some insight into the work she's been doing with Oxford University in systematic review development. So we'll see you again next week, 8 p.m. Thursday. Thank you for your attendance. I hope to see you again. Bye for now.